Section 5 of To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 11. No, she thought, putting together some of the pictures he had cut out, a refrigerator, a mowing machine, a gentleman in evening dress. Children never forget. For this reason it was so important what one said, and what one did, and it was a relief when they went to bed. For now she need not think about anybody. She could be herself, by herself. And that was what now she often felt the need of, to think. Well, not even to think. To be silent, to be alone. All the being and the doing, expansive, glittering, vocal, evaporated, and one shrunk, with a sense of solemnity, to being oneself, a wedge-shaped core of darkness, something invisible to others. Although she continued to knit and sat upright, it was thus that she felt herself. And this self, having shed its attachments, was free for the strangest adventures. When life sank down for a moment, the range of experience seemed limitless. And to everybody there was always this sense of unlimited resources, she supposed, one after another, she, Lily, Augustus Carmichael, must feel, our apparitions, the things you know us by, are simply childish. Beneath it is all dark, it is all spreading, it is unfathomably deep. But now and again we rise to the surface, and that is what you see us by. Her horizon seemed to her limitless. There were all the places she had not seen, the Indian plains. She felt herself pushing aside the thick leather curtain of a church in Rome. This core of darkness could go anywhere, for no one saw it. They could not stop it, she thought, exulting. There was freedom, there was peace. There was, most welcome of all, a summoning together, a resting on a platform of stability. Not as one's self did one find rest ever, in her experience. She accomplished here something dexterous with her needles, but as a wedge of darkness. Losing personality, one lost the fret, the hurry, the stir, and there rose to her lips always some exclamation of triumph over life when things came together in this peace, this rest, this eternity. And pausing there, she looked out to meet that stroke of the lighthouse, the long, steady stroke, the last of the three, which was her stroke, for watching them in this mood always at this hour, one could not help attaching oneself to one thing especially of the things one saw, and this thing, the long steady stroke, was her stroke. Often she found herself sitting and looking, with her work in her hands, until she became the thing she looked at, that light, for example. And it would lift up on it some little phrase or other which had been lying in her mind like that, "Children don't forget, children don't forget," which she would repeat and begin adding to it. "It will end, she said. "It will come, it will come," when suddenly she added, "We are in the hands of the Lord." But instantly she was annoyed with herself for saying that. Who had said it? Not she. She had been trapped into saying something she did not mean. She looked up over her knitting and met the third stroke, and it seemed to her like her own eyes meeting her own eyes, searching as she alone could search into her mind and her heart, purifying out of existence that lie, any lie. She praised herself in praising the light, without vanity, for she was stern, she was searching, she was beautiful like that light. It was odd, she thought, how, if one was alone, one leant to inanimate things, trees, streams, flowers, felt they expressed one, felt they became one, felt they knew one, in a sense were one, felt an irrational tenderness thus. She looked at that long, steady light, as for oneself. There rose, and she looked and looked with her needles suspended, there curled up off the floor of the mind, rose from the lake of one's being, a mist, a bride to meet her lover. What brought her to say that? We are in the hands of the Lord, she wondered. The insincerity slipping in among the truths roused her, annoyed her. She returned to her knitting again. How could any Lord have made this world? She asked. With her mind she had always seized the fact that there is no reason, order, justice, but suffering, death, the poor. There was no treachery too base for the world to commit, she knew that. No happiness lasted, she knew that. She knitted with firm composure, slightly pursing her lips, and, without being aware of it, so stiffened and composed the lines of her face in a habit of sternness, that when her husband passed, though he was chuckling at the thought that Hume, the philosopher, grown enormously fat, had stuck in a bog, he could not help noting, as he passed, the sternness at the heart of her beauty. It saddened him, and her remoteness pained him, and he felt, as he passed, that he could not protect her, and, when he reached the hedge, he was sad. He could do nothing to help her. He must stand by and watch her. Indeed, the infernal truth was, he made things worse for her. He was irritable, he was touchy, he had lost his temper over the lighthouse. He looked into the hedge, into its intricacy, its darkness. Always, Mrs. Ramsey felt, one helped oneself out of solitude reluctantly, by laying hold of some little odd or end, some sound, some sight. She listened, but it was all very still. Cricket was over, the children were in their baths, there was only the sound of the sea. She stopped knitting. She held the long, reddish-brown stocking dangling in her hands a moment. She saw the light again. With some irony in her interrogation, for when one woke at all one's relations changed, she looked at the steady light, the pitiless, the remorseless, which was so much her, yet so little her, which had her at its beck and call. She woke in the night and saw it bent across their bed, stroking the floor. But for all that, she thought, watching it with fascination, hypnotized, as if it were stroking with its silver fingers some sealed vessel in her brain, whose bursting would flood her with delight, she had known happiness, exquisite happiness, intense happiness, and it silvered the rough waves a little more brightly, as daylight faded, and the blue went out of the sea, and it rolled in waves of pure lemon, which curved and swelled and broke upon the beach, and the ecstasy burst in her eyes, and waves of pure delight raced over the floor of her mind, and she felt, it is enough, it is enough. He turned and saw her. Ah, she was lovely, lovelier now than ever, he thought. But he could not speak to her. He could not interrupt her. He wanted urgently to speak to her now that James was gone and she was alone at last. But he resolved, no, he would not interrupt her. She was aloof from him now in her beauty, in her sadness. He would let her be, and he passed her without a word, though it hurt him that she should look so distant and he could not reach her, he could do nothing to help her. And again he would have passed her without a word, had she not, at that very moment, given him of her own free will what she knew he would never ask, and called to him and taken the green shawl off the picture frame and gone to him, for he wished, she knew, to protect her. Chapter 12. She folded the green shawl about her shoulders. She took his arm. His beauty was so great, she said, beginning to speak of Kennedy the gardener, at once he was so awfully handsome that she couldn't dismiss him. There was a ladder against the greenhouse, and little lumps of putty stuck about, for they were beginning to mend the greenhouse. Yes, but as she strolled along with her husband, she felt that that particular source of worry had been placed. She had it on the tip of her tongue to say, as they strolled, "It'll cost £50." But instead, for her heart failed her about money, she talked about Jasper shooting birds, and he said, at once, soothing her instantly, that it was natural in a boy, and he trusted he would find better ways of amusing himself before long. Her husband was so sensible, so just. And so she said, yes, all children go through stages, and began considering the dahlias in the big bed, and wondering what about next year's flowers, and had he heard the children's nickname for Charles Tansley, she asked. The atheist, they called him, the little atheist. He's not a polished specimen, said Mr. Ramsey. Far from it, said Mrs. Ramsey. She supposed it was all right leaving him to his own devices, Mrs. Ramsey said, wondering whether it was any use sending down bulbs. Did they plant them? Oh, he has his dissertation to write, said Mr. Ramsey. She knew all about that, said Mrs. Ramsey. He talked of nothing else. It was about the influence of somebody upon something. Well, it's all he has to count on, said Mr. Ramsey. Pray heaven he won't fall in love with Prue, said Mrs. Ramsey. He'd disinherit her if she married him, said Mr. Ramsey. He did not look at the flowers which his wife was considering, but at a spot about a foot or so above them. There was no harm in him, he added, and was just about to say that anyhow he was the only young man in England who admired his, when he choked it back. He would not bother her again about his books. These flowers seemed creditable, Mr. Ramsey said, lowering his gaze and noticing something red, something brown. Yes, but then these she had put in with her own hands, said Mrs. Ramsey. The question was, what happened if she sent bulbs down? Did Kennedy plant them? It was his incurable laziness, she added, moving on. If she stood over him all day long with a spade in her hand, he did sometimes do a stroke of work. So they strolled along towards the red-hot pokers. You're teaching your daughters to exaggerate, said Mr. Ramsey, reproving her. Her Aunt Camilla was far worse than she was, Mrs. Ramsey remarked. Nobody ever held up your Aunt Camilla as a model of virtue that I'm aware of, said Mr. Ramsey. She was the most beautiful woman I ever saw, said Mrs. Ramsey. Somebody else was that, said Mr. Ramsey. Prue was going to be far more beautiful than she was, said Mrs. Ramsey. He saw no trace of it, said Mr. Ramsey. Well then, look tonight, said Mrs. Ramsey. They paused. He wished Andrew could be induced to work harder. He would lose every chance of a scholarship if he didn't. Oh, scholarships, she said. Mr. Ramsey thought her foolish for saying that, about a serious thing like a scholarship. He should be very proud of Andrew if he got a scholarship, he said. She would be just as proud of him if he didn't, she answered. They disagreed always about this, but it did not matter. She liked him to believe in scholarships, and he liked her to be proud of Andrew whatever he did. Suddenly she remembered those little paths on the edge of the cliffs. Wasn't it late? She asked. They hadn't come home yet. He flicked his watch carelessly open. But it was only just past 7. He held his watch open for a moment, deciding that he would tell her what he had felt on the terrace. To begin with, it was not reasonable to be so nervous. Andrew could look after himself. Then he wanted to tell her that when he was walking on the terrace just now, here he became uncomfortable, as if he were breaking into that solitude, that aloofness, that remoteness of hers. But she pressed him. What had he wanted to tell her, she asked, thinking it was about going to the Lighthouse, that he was sorry he had said, "Damn you." But no, he did not like to see her look so sad, he said. Only wool-gathering, she protested, flushing a little. They both felt uncomfortable, as if they did not know whether to go on or go back. She had been reading fairy tales to James, she said. No, they could not share that. They could not say that. They had reached the gap between the 2 clumps of red-hot pokers, and there was the lighthouse again, but she would not let herself look at it. Had she known that he was looking at her, she thought, she would not have let herself sit there thinking. She disliked anything that reminded her that she had been seen sitting thinking. So she looked over her shoulder at the town. The lights were rippling and running as if they were drops of silver water held firm in a wind. And all the poverty, all the suffering had turned to that, Mrs. Ramsey thought. The lights of the town, and of the harbour, and of the boats seemed like a phantom net floating there to mark something which had sunk. Well, if he could not share her thoughts, Mr. Ramsey said to himself, he would be off then, on his own. He wanted to go on thinking, telling himself the story how Hume was stuck in a bog. He wanted to laugh. But first it was nonsense to be anxious about Andrew. When he was Andrew's age, he used to walk about the country all day long, with nothing but a biscuit in his pocket, and nobody bothered about him or thought that he had fallen over a cliff. He said aloud he thought he would be off for a day's walk, if the weather held. He had had about enough of Banks and of Carmichael. He would like a little solitude. Yes, she said. It annoyed him that she did not protest. She knew that he would never do it. He was too old now to walk all day long with a biscuit in his pocket. She worried about the boys, but not about him. Years ago, before he had married, he thought, looking across the bay, as they stood between the clumps of red-hot pokers, he had walked all day. He had made a meal off bread and cheese in a public house. He had worked 10 hours at a stretch. An old woman just popped her head in now and again and saw to the fire. That was the country he liked best, over there, those sandhills dwindling away into darkness. One could walk all day without meeting a soul. There was not a house scarcely, not a single village for miles on end. One could worry things out alone. There were little sandy beaches where no one had been since the beginning of time. The seals sat up and looked at you. It sometimes seemed to him that in a little house out there, alone— He broke off, sighing. He had no right. The father of 8 children, he reminded himself. And he would have been a beast and a cur to wish a single thing altered. Andrew would be a better man than he had been. Prue would be a beauty, her mother said. They would stem the flood a bit. That was a good bit of work on the whole, his 8 children. They showed he did not damn the poor little universe entirely, for, on an evening like this, he thought, looking at the land dwindling away, the little island seemed pathetically small, half swallowed up in the sea. "Poor little place," he murmured with a sigh. She heard him. He said the most melancholy things, but she noticed that directly he had said them he always seemed more cheerful than usual. All this phrase-making was a game, she thought, for if she had said half what he said, she would have blown her brains out by now. It annoyed her, this phrase-making, and she said to him, in a matter-of-fact way, that it was a perfectly lovely evening. And what was he groaning about, she asked, half laughing, half complaining, for she guessed what he was thinking. He would have written better books if he had not married. He was not complaining, he said. She knew that he did not complain. She knew that he had nothing whatever to complain of. And he seized her hand and raised it to his lips and kissed it with an intensity that brought the tears to her eyes, and quickly he dropped it. They turned away from the view and began to walk up the path where the silver-green spear-like plants grew, arm in arm. His arm was almost like a young man's arm, Mrs. Ramsey thought, thin and hard, and she thought with delight how strong he still was, though he was over 60, and how untamed and optimistic, and how strange it was that being convinced, as he was, of all sorts of horrors, seemed not to depress him, but to cheer him. Was it not odd, she reflected? Indeed, he seemed to her sometimes made differently from other people, born blind, deaf, and dumb to the ordinary things, but to the extraordinary things, with an eye like an eagle's. His understanding often astonished her. But did he notice the flowers? No. Did he notice the view? No. Did he even notice his own daughter's beauty, or whether there was pudding on his plate or roast beef? He would sit at table with them like a person in a dream. and his habit of talking aloud, or saying poetry aloud, was growing on him, she was afraid, for sometimes it was awkward. Best and brightest, come away! Poor Miss Giddings, when he shouted that at her, almost jumped out of her skin. But then, Mrs. Ramsey, though instantly taking his side against all the silly Giddingses in the world, then, she thought, intimating by a little pressure on his arm that he walked uphill too fast for her, and she must stop for a moment to see whether those were fresh molehills on the bank, then, she thought, stooping down to look, a great mind like his must be different in every way from ours. All the great men she had ever known, she thought, deciding that a rabbit must have got in, were like that, and it was good for young men, though the atmosphere of lecture-rooms was stuffy and depressing to her beyond endurance almost, simply to hear him, simply to look at him. But without shooting rabbits, how was one to keep them down, she wondered. It might be a rabbit, it might be a mole. Some creature anyhow was ruining her evening primroses. And looking up, she saw above the thin trees the first pulse of the full-throbbing star, and wanted to make her husband look at it, for the sight gave her such keen pleasure. But she stopped herself. He never looked at things. If he did, all he would say would be, "Poor little world," with one of his sighs. At that moment he said, "Very fine," to please her, and pretended to admire the flowers. But she knew quite well that he did not admire them, or even realize that they were there. It was only to please her. Ah, but was that not Lily Briscoe strolling along with William Banks? She focused her short-sighted eyes upon the backs of a retreating couple. Yes, indeed it was. Did that not mean that they would marry? Yes, it must. What an admirable idea! They must marry. Chapter 13. He had been to Amsterdam, Mr. Banks was saying, as he strolled across the lawn with Lily Briscoe. He had seen the Rembrandts. He had been to Madrid. Unfortunately it was Good Friday, and the Prado was shut. He had been to Rome. Had Miss Briscoe never been to Rome? Oh, she should. It would be a wonderful experience for her, the Sistine Chapel, Michelangelo, and Padua with its Giottos. His wife had been in bad health for many years, so that their sightseeing had been on a modest scale. She had been to Brussels, she had been to Paris, but only for a flying visit to see an aunt who was ill. She had been to Dresden. There were masses of pictures she had not seen. However, Lily Briscoe reflected, perhaps it was better not to see pictures, they only made one hopelessly discontented with one's own work. Mr. Banks thought one could carry that point of view too far. We can't all be Titians, and we can't all be Darwins, he said. At the same time he doubted whether you could have your Darwin and your Titian if it weren't for humble people like ourselves. Lily would have liked to pay him a compliment. "You're not humble, Mr. Banks," she would have liked to have said. But he did not want compliments. Most men do, she thought. And she was a little ashamed of her impulse, and said nothing, while he remarked that perhaps what he was saying did not apply to pictures. Anyhow, said Lily, tossing off her little insincerity, she would always go on painting, because it interested her. Yes, said Mr. Banks, he was sure she would. And, as they reached the end of the lawn, he was asking her whether she had difficulty in finding subjects in London, when they turned and saw the Ramseys. So that is marriage, Lily thought, a man and a woman looking at a girl throwing a ball. That is what Mrs. Ramsey tried to tell me the other night, she thought. For she was wearing a green shawl, and they were standing close together, watching Prue and Jasper throwing catches. And suddenly the meaning which, for no reason at all, as perhaps they are stepping out of the tube or ringing a doorbell, descends on people, making them symbolical, making them representative, came upon them, and made them in the dusk standing, looking, the symbols of marriage, husband and wife. Then, after an instant, the symbolical outline which transcended the real figures sank down again, and they became, as they met them, Mr. and Mrs. Ramsey watching the children throwing catches. But still for a moment, though Mrs. Ramsey greeted them with her usual smile, "Oh, she's thinking we're going to get married," Lily thought, and said, "I have triumphed to-night," meaning that for once Mr. Banks had agreed to dine with them, and not run off to his own lodging where his man cooked vegetables properly. Still, for one moment, there was a sense of things having been blown apart, of space, of irresponsibility as the ball soared high, and they followed it, and lost it, and saw the one star and the draped branches. In the failing light they all looked sharp-edged and ethereal, and divided by great distances. Then, darting backwards over the vast space, for it seemed as if solidity had vanished altogether, Prue ran full tilt into them, and caught the ball brilliantly high up in her left hand, and her mother said, "Haven't they come back yet?" Whereupon the spell was broken. Mr. Ramsey felt free now to laugh out loud at the thought that Hume had stuck in a bog, and an old woman rescued him on condition he said the Lord's Prayer, and chuckling to himself he strolled off to his study. Mrs. Ramsey, bringing Prue back into throwing catches again, from which she had escaped, asked, "Did Nancy go with them?" End of Section 5